Hi, David. Honda recently announcing that it is delaying its plans when it comes to an EV battery plant to the tune of $15 billion. A few questions in there. Is the deal still on the table? And what do you attribute that to? Is it the economic uncertainty, tariff uncertainty, or is it the lack of demand when it comes to electric vehicles?
I think it's all of those things, and I think the reality is that maybe not unlike some other projects in Canada, Honda has stipulated that this project is going to be paused for 2 years, not going to be scrubbed entirely, and also not going to affect any of the existing employment or production at their facility in Alliston. But to your point, I mean, I think the reality is that all of these factors have kind of conspired to create an environment where there's a high degree of uncertainty from with respect to consumer demand for EVs. Let's be clear, there is demand there, but it's not at the same level that I think both governments and, in fact, probably industry were anticipating it was going to be at. And then we have the other factors of our economic situation currently, over the last couple of months, the whole tariff situation, you add that all together and it creates a very, very uncertain and highly, I guess, tentative investment climate for any automaker at this juncture.
It's been a month or so of auto tariffs. What specifically are you hearing from your members? We have seen GM and Stellantis pull back when it comes to, on the labor front, rather, I should say, with respect to layoffs. How are companies navigating this? What are you hearing?
Well, it's highly problematic, and I think every company, the tariffs really, in some ways, aren't a surprise. I know President Trump campaigned on 10% general tariffs, so I think even back before he was elected, companies were already doing some preliminary planning, at least in terms of how to deal with a tariff environment. That said, companies have undertaken efforts to try and mitigate the impact of the tariff. Some of that would include things like moving inventory on either side of the border to deal with the tariff impact, minimize the tariff impact by putting Canadian-made vehicles on the U.S. side of the border to avoid the tariff, at least initially, and then bring U.S. vehicles onto the Canadian side to avoid the counter tariff. But at some point, those inventory levels are going to run out, and then the price impact of the tariffs will start to be felt by consumers, and that's not going to be too far out. So if it's not already happening, it will be start to be happening very soon. But from our perspective, I think with as it ties into this announcement specifically, we talked earlier about the different factors. EVs are continuing to be purchased by consumers, but the problem is that some of the supports that I think the industry had always counted on being there from the government, things like incentives, consumer incentives to buy the vehicles because they're more costly than internal combustion engine vehicles. Things like continuing to build out the infrastructure so that consumers know that they can charge their vehicle wherever and whenever they need to, fairly quickly and reliably. So those two things are really serve to certainly not help the adoption of electric vehicles. At the same time, the vehicle manufacturers have been mandated by the federal government under a zero emission vehicle mandate to hit certain levels of EV sales to consumers or pay penalties if they don't. So from our perspective, one of our first asks, I think, of the new government and his cabinet, Prime Minister Carney's cabinet, will be, look, we need to pause these regulations. We recognize the government has environmental aspirations, and we need to sit down and figure out how we can help them achieve their environmental aspirations, but not unduly penalize the automotive industry at this time when everybody is under a tremendous amount of stress, fiscal stress.
And is that how you would view then that all these incentives coming off the table then from the various levels of government as a penalty of sorts?
Well, for sure. And I think the federal government's incentive ended in January. I mean, it was supposed to end in March, but it was very popular. But there was no guarantee that it was going to be recapitalized. So we don't have the $5,000 federal incentive anymore. And in Quebec, I believe their incentive was around $8,000, if I'm not mistaken. And that was withdrawn for a couple of months at the beginning of the year. It's been put back in place, but at a lower level, and that will expire in 2027 as well, beginning of 2027. And BC just removed their purchase incentive as well. So it's a bit of a tall order to be trying to persuade consumers to move into electric vehicles when the cost differential can be anywhere from $12 to $15,000 or more between purchasing an internal combustion engine vehicle and an electric vehicle. So it just makes it that much more difficult. The early adopters all have their electric vehicles, and I think as we try and move more consumers into electric vehicles, it just becomes that more of a challenge, and increasingly so when we don't have the incentives and the consumers don't have confidence that the charging infrastructure is there to allow them to use their vehicle as they would a normal internal combustion engine vehicle.
The federal budget is yet to be announced, yet to be tabled, rather, yet to be announced. What are you hoping to see? I know that you had touched on it somewhat, what your hopes for the auto sector from the new federal government. Are you hoping to see something in that budget for your sector?
Well, sure. I mean, I think there were a number of investment tax credits that still haven't been entirely promulgated that would assist in supporting the investments like the Honda investment. So those are important. We touched on the incentives. I think the Liberal platform before the election mentioned that they were going to look at reintroducing the incentives. Whether they do that or not remains to be seen. But I think the larger question in our mind is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the need to take a hard look at the mandate, the zero emission vehicle mandate, given that the circumstances have changed fundamentally since that piece of legislation came to pass in late 2003. And I think the other thing, if we're going to really capitalize on our strengths or our opportunity, let's call it that, of having all of the elements that we need to produce EVs in Canada, in Ontario. We've got all of the elements in the ground. We really need to get those elements out of the ground, get them processed, build up our EV ecosystem, and produce electric vehicles in Canada. But we can't do that without a concerted effort. And the previous government had three ministers that were responsible for EVs. They had one minister responsible for the infrastructure, one minister responsible for the incentives, and one minister responsible for the regulatory regime. If we're serious about this, and I think that what I've seen of Prime Minister Carney so far, he's very pragmatic, wants to get things done. Having three ministers look after something like this is almost a recipe for inefficiency, in my view. And we need to really focus our time and attention on trying to migrate our industry to what could be a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the US by electrifying it. But we need a concerted effort, and we need to, I think, almost have a government industry table set up to achieve that objective.